Hi there. Somebody might ask of the Church of Nowhere what its attitude towards abortion is. This is a common question that all religions get asked, I suppose, eventually. And I think that the argument for anti-natalism is actually the same argument that would make most abortions unavailable. And as I understand it, the anti-natalist argument is that it is cruel to reproduce because you can't ask the fetus if it wants to be born into a world that is, on balance, more nasty than it is nice, depending, of course, on social class, I would add. But that would lead to the discussion about the poor people not being allowed to breed, which in fact was originally put forward by Jonathan Swift, the satirist of the 17th century. And a lot of people were terribly shocked by that. But when you think about it, it does have a slight merit to it, although intuitively it feels like it's a very cruel thing to say. Stop the poor from reproducing. And so you can't ask the fetus whether it wants to be born until the fetus is actually born, when of course it is too late. So the idea is to make it illegal or socially unacceptable in some way to actually reproduce. Now, I was thinking about this, and in fact, just on a slight detour, it would be the case that the only way you could do this using legislation would be to make it a legal requirement of all men to have a vasectomy, on the grounds that a vasectomy is a reversible procedure, is also not 100% guaranteed to not result in a pregnancy, and it's also to do with men having to sacrifice their fertility, which they wouldn't even notice anyway, because most men just want sex. They don't even want the woman to become pregnant in most cases. So I can't see that vasectomy is very anti-libertarian. I mean, if it is already the case that you can't smoke in a public bar or even in a bus stop, surely that's against your liberty, your civil liberties. You have to wear a seatbelt if you're going in a vehicle. Surely that's sort of interfering with your private space, because your car is your private space, but the state interferes in that space and says that you can't wear a seat. You've got to wear a seatbelt, right? Otherwise, you get fined. And there's more legislation, for example, over childcare. It's a felony to expose your child to adult content, for example, in California. In a lot of countries, it's a felony, to hit your children, even though the hitting is done in the privacy of their own home, and you could say that's anti-libertarian as well. So basically, asking all men to have a vasectomy is not a huge uh, evasion of civil liberties if there's already other pieces of legislation which seem to do the same thing. Although a lot of Republicans, of course, in the USA would say, well, there's the nub of the problem. You've got the state interfering and trying to run our lives for us, and we would like to make our own moral decisions and health decisions, thank you very much, which is an argument, certainly. Um, so basically, it would be made de facto illegal to reproduce and to have babies, because it would be a legal requirement for all men to have a vasectomy. And then, of course, a lot of men would be jumping up and down saying it's not fair that one gender should have to be sterilised effectively, whilst the other gender doesn't. But bear in mind, as I said, vasectomy is reversible. So it's not like a sterilisation of a woman, which would be fairly irreversible, really, unless she was going to have a baby by a proxy mother or something like that. Hideously complicated in legal terms, I understand that. But the same argument that you can't tell the you can't ask the fetus to be born. I would suggest also that in principle you can't ask the fetus to die. So if you've got a fetus in the womb, you can't ask the fetus if it would like to be aborted or not. And given the fact that we know about animal behavior, the simplest of animals seem to not want to die, it would seem that the fetus would probably say, I don't want to die. And it wouldn't understand the question, do you want to be born? But it would certainly understand the question, do you want to die, on the most primitive of neurological levels. So given that, that you can't ask the fetus if it wants to be aborted, pretty much all abortion would be banned under this philosophical assertion, except where the pregnancy would actually affect the mother's life. And then abortion would be a matter of saving a person that in most cases would say, I want to live, rather than my baby. I don't mind my baby being aborted because I want to live, basically. So you could ask a sentient being if she wants to live and get an answer, unless of course she answers that she doesn't want to live. And then that becomes even more complicated, but we won't go into that. The point is that, so the arguments that you can't ask a fetus whether it wants to be born or not, you can't ask a fetus whether it wants to die or not. So basically, you can imagine a society where 99% of all men have had a vasectomy. Hard to enforce legally, of course, but it would be sort of, as smoking has become unacceptable socially, so gradually it would become unacceptable for men not to have a vasectomy. So you can imagine that a man has a vasectomy, but then he does get his partner pregnant, and she can't have an abortion, okay? Because her life isn't being threatened. She can't have an abortion on demand. So she has to go through with the pregnancy, and then because she doesn't want to look after the child, and philosophically, why should she want to? And why should she want to have brought in a baby into this horrible world anyway? She would have to give up the child for adoption, since the child would have to be looked after by somebody, or the state, but it would be better if it was somebody, a private family, loving family, or whatever. And so the baby would be brought up. So it's not even like you're banning reproduction exactly, because if you ban abortion at the same time as you ban reproduction, which is a kind of a seems a very weird contradiction in terms, you would actually have a situation socially where everything swings and roundabouts, everything would sort of balance out, really. And people would be aware that becoming pregnant was not a good thing. But once you were pregnant, abortion wouldn't be a good thing either, not a solution either. So it would lead to obviously, more children being actually adopted. And considering a lot of gay couples at the moment want to adopt children, it wouldn't be. They would probably be quite in favour of this social trend, because it would mean it would be easier for them to adopt children without going to all the rigmarole of I don't know, of IVU, fertilization, and things like that. Which isn't safe, or there's a palaver and difficult, and I don't know. You just wouldn't want to go down. It'd be much easier just simply to adopt a child, wouldn't it, if you were a gay couple, really, let's face it. So I think it's an excellent piece of legislation. But of course, I know it opens up the problems of libertarian issues, of course, basically. But it also opens up the problem of class stratification, because you could say that if a person became pregnant, in order to keep the baby, I mean, they couldn't have an abortion, but if they kept the baby, they'd have to prove that the baby, there was a net benefit for them having the baby, rather than letting it go for adoption. And indeed, it might be, you'd have to have a law which basically applied to everybody. All men have a vasectomy, not just working class men, or you couldn't have a ban on, I don't know, crusties or hippies having babies. Everybody would have to have the same legislation applied, to be fair. So I think, but I find it very interesting that the same objection, moral objection, that it's cruel to reproduce, it's also cruel to have an abortion as well. And because of non-communication with the fetus, who is the party being affected by the decision, you see. Except, of course, in the case of where the pregnancy would kill the mother, in which case that apparently, under this scenario, would override any moral objection to abortion itself. And this actually is sort of the Catholic position. I know that a lot of extreme Protestants are even against allowing abortion. They're against abortion in all circumstances. Which, of course, if it's cruel to have an abortion, then they might be correct in that blanket ban. I don't know, but these are the same people, of course, that don't mind munching on steaks and and killing animals for food. Certainly, I've spoken to a few vegan women, and of course, some of them would say, I'm not going to have an abortion under any circumstances because it is destruction of a sentient being, which, of course, is their own, personal morality or personal philosophy or personal decision. But I think even they would probably say if their life was in danger, that moral position might have to be modified, especially if they were a mother to children existing already, and then to deprive the children of their mother simply on the basis that you couldn't have an abortion on the basis of some kind of ethical decision. So life is complicated. There are moral dilemmas we sweep up in our faces, and sometimes we don't know what to do for the best. And there are moral conflicts arise, as we all know, of course. But anyway, I'm rather sort of struck on this idea, because certainly there are too many people in the world, 7.5 billion human beings. And certainly, if it became a law that all men all over the world had to have a vasectomy, it's also a relative easy procedure compared to sterilization of women, which is a far more complex procedure, and as I say, it could be in many cases irreversible. But of course, you would run into a huge amount of cultural objection, and even armed resistance in some countries. If you said that men had to sterilize themselves, I think it would be a military dictatorship that would have to enforce this legislation, which of course would be unacceptable in other ways. You see. So I think anti-natalism and anti-abortionism, although they're probably related, I think at the end of the day, it does boil down to the individual choice involved. And I would say it was difficult to legislate all over the world, but certainly it might, and a lot of people would then say, well, we're not legislating for a mass vasectomy of men if it doesn't happen all over the world, because wouldn't be fair. I mean, why should our country be singled out for mass vasectomies, and that country over there it can resist it on religious grounds or something like that? Wouldn't be fair, you see. So I think anti-natalism and the anti-abortion arguments do support each other, and that's very interesting philosophically. But I think in terms of legality, it is all going to be up to the individual choice. And given that the individual chooses to do things that everybody else is doing, I don't really see much hope of depopulating the earth in quite the way that anti-natalists would like to see.